Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 2017 Trevor Reese Memorial Lecture. My name is Ian Henderson and I'm the Director of the Menzies Centre for Australian Studies, which in association with the University of London's Institute of Commonwealth Studies has hosted this annual lecture since 1984. A quick note before I go any further on the format of this lecture. It's a formal public lecture. And afterwards we'll have a formal vote of thanks from my colleague Dr. Simon Slight, which will then be followed by questions. So Penny has agreed to take questions from the floor so we can have some discussion. Questions and discussion can then continue down the hall in chapters where we have wine and nibblies for you, and so this is also a celebratory event in that case. I'd like to extend a particularly warm welcome on behalf of King's College London to Hilary Reese and the Reese entourage. It's always one of the pleasures of this series to see you all again and catch up with your activities and also share some of our own. Hilary, your ongoing support of the Centre is hugely appreciated by me personally and the whole Menzies Centre team. On the side of it, there she is. Thank you, Hilary. The Trevor Reese Memorial Lecture celebrates the life and career of Dr. Reese, a distinguished historian of the British Commonwealth and Australia and reader at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. He was author of Australia in the 20th Century and first editor of the Journal of Imperial and Commonwealth History, an august publication now in its 45th volume. The Menzies Centre itself, moreover, is very much a legacy of Dr. Reese's work. The Reese Lecture is always given by a scholar who shows promise of becoming an exceptional research leader in her field. Previous Reese lecturers have included Frank Bongiorno, Joy DeMusi, Andrew Hassam, Penny Russell, Stuart McIntyre, the Menzies Centre's own Carl Bridge, and back in 1984, Henry Reynolds. So you take my point. Just talking with tonight's Reese lecturer, Associate Professor Penelope Edmonds, speaking with her last month in Tasmania, and yesterday just across the way in Somerset House, makes me certain for one that she is already treading that path to research leadership. Now, all the gremlins in all of Britain that can bedevil public speaking events gathered in Manchester this afternoon around our Prime Minister, so I feel pretty confident things will go well tonight. More than well, the gods are smiling upon us for more from good fortune than meticulous planning. Penny happens to be delivering the Reese Lecture tonight. Right at the moment, King's College London is securing a strategic partnership with Penny's home institution, the University of Tasmania. This will see the Centre help broker a series of deepening research and even teaching relationships with Tassie, a place close to my own heart, for it was my own home between 1983 and 1991, and it remains the home of some of my very close family members. The University of Tasmania, what is more, will help establish the key innovation of my directorship of the Menzies Centre, an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander program here at King's. It's my pleasure then to give the first public acknowledgement of the imminent King's College London University of Tasmania partnership here tonight. But Penny is more than a state rep tonight. She is the 2017 Reese Lecturer, and I want to tell you a bit more about her. At the University of Tasmania, she's an Associate Professor and Australian Research Council Future Fellow in the Humanities School. Before completing her PhD in History at the University of Melbourne and lecturing there, she was an Andrew W. Mellon Fellow at the National Gallery of Art of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, and spent 8 years as a conservator and later curator. As a conservator, I got Manchester on the brain, and later curator with Museum Victoria's extensive cultural, natural history, science and technology collections in Melbourne. She was a team member for the development of the first Banjalaka Aboriginal Gallery at Museum Victoria, led by Dr. Gay Sculthorpe, who happens also to be in the room. And Penny was later curator for the exhibition Indigenous Australia Now, Australia's gift to the 2004 Olympic Games in Athens. Penny is the author of 2 monographs, Urbanising Frontiers, Indigenous Peoples and Settlers in 19th Century Pacific Rim Cities, and last year's Settler Colonialism and Reconciliation, frontier violence, affective performances, and imaginative refoundings, part of Palgrave Macmillan's Cambridge Imperial and Postcolonial Studies series. She also has several edited collections up her sleeve. Penny is politically committed to cross-cultural and Indigenous-centred histories, and her interests in these, in public history and performance, and in objects, come together to throw light on distinct genres of performance manifest in today's settlers' nations. Speaking on heart, power, treaty truth, affective political performances in post-reconciliation Australia, please join me in welcoming Associate Professor Penelope Edmonds to deliver the 2017 Trevor Reese Memorial Lecture. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Ian Henderson, and also to Dr. Simon Sleish, and especially to the Menzies Australia Centre at King's College here tonight for inviting me to present the Trevor Reese Memorial Lecture this evening, and I'm most honoured. Before we begin, although we're in London, I want to thank the Aboriginal artists whose work I show in this lecture this evening, and I also want to acknowledge the peoples whose histories I'm speaking of today, the Wirrayare people of what is now New England, the region in New South Wales in Australia, and the Muhanina people of the Hobart region, and Tasmanian Aboriginal people more broadly. And I want to pay my respects to Aboriginal elders past and present. Importantly too, of course, I wish to thank Hilary Reese and the Reese family. And tonight, I'd like to think that Professor Trevor Reese's work on the Commonwealth, his work on international relations and Commonwealth countries, given that, I'd like to think that he would perhaps appreciate this discussion tonight around a powerful political phenomenon, reconciliation. This movement, this genre or paradigm springs out of the histories, colonial, constitutional, these relationships of so many Commonwealth countries, or British settler societies as we might think of them. And it's here that matters of colonialism and empire, of course, continue to shape the present. They have powerful legacies today, as I hope you'll see. Indeed, and to begin, in the settler nations, such as Australia, how do we overcome the deep legacies of violence that accompanied this colonialism? This is a violence that sits disturbingly in our psyches as Australians. It creates inequities that have ongoing structural consequences. These Commonwealth nations, if you like, for example, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, are generally resistant to formal forms of decolonisation that we might be most familiar with, say India, for example. And it's here in these settler nations, as they are termed, that the alluring and utopian politics of reconciliation really come into play. In May this year, just 5 months ago, at Uluru, or Ayers Rock, as some of you will know, at the very heart of the nation, the Uluru Statement from the Heart was delivered by the First Nations National Constitutional Convention to the Australian nation. The Indigenous writers of the statement importantly placed matters of history and truth-telling, Aboriginal sovereignty and power, and treaty or makarata, the Yolngu or Arnhem Land term for peacemaking after a fight, at the very forefront of agreement making and constitutional change. Indigenous Australian people did not reject federal constitutional change outright. Many desperately want it, as do non-Indigenous peoples, of course. But they did reject the minimalist proposition of simply changing a few tiny words in the Australian Constitution to acknowledge them. Rather, the Statement from the Heart insisted upon a far-reaching and thoroughgoing agenda for the nation, delivered importantly to the people of Australia from Indigenous Australia. Now, this statement from the heart of the country, Uluru, invoked, interestingly for me, the politics of heart. And what is of interest is that this political performance, I think, can be understood as part of a long lineage or repertoire of political and affective Indigenous settler invocations for peace building and agreement making in settler colonies that have been shaped by violence and dispossession. These political performances of diplomacy and peace building are very key, and they're part of, if you like, a wider global paradigm of reconciliation, redress, and calls for transitional justice in the aftermath of war or trauma, in the age of what some call the age of apology. This is a very powerful image. It was in the media in May. Representatives of the convention, 3 important Aboriginal leaders, presented the statement to the people of Australia. Megan Davis, Professor of Law and Aboriginal woman from Queensland. Pat Anderson, who has the Order of Australia and is chair of the Lowitja Institute, Australia's National Institute for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and from the Northern Territory, and Noel Pearson, Aboriginal lawyer, academic, land rights activist, and founder of the Cape York Institute. Pat Anderson holds a wira or a coolaman. This is a woman's water carrier or food carrier or even a baby carrier in which the statement is held. There's also a woman's digging stick there too, a very important symbolic and gendered tool. Noel Pearson is carrying a shield. The image tells us that this is both a message and a cultural gift, a political statement of power to Australians. The federal endorsement of the convention, the months of state talks that led up to it all around the country in the form of 12 dialogues in various states, and the intense media coverage around it meant that this event was both a political and a mediatised performance, an event of national significance, and speaking to the urgent and unresolved issues of the nation. So let's take a quick look at the statement, and I've picked out some of the important things here. The statement tells us that Aboriginal people were the first sovereign nations of the Australian continent and its adjacent lands from time immemorial. This sovereignty, they assert, has never been ceded or extinguished and coexists with the sovereignty of the Crown. They invoke the wounds of colonialism and invasion. They note the high levels of Indigenous incarceration, and they declare the torment of our powerlessness. They then call for a range of key items: constitutional reforms to empower our people and to take a rightful place in the country. They note, when we have power over our destiny, our children will flourish. They will walk in 2 worlds, and their culture will be a gift to their country. They call for the establishment of a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution. They call for a Makarrata Commission, and they say Makarrata, or treaty, is the culmination of our agenda, the coming together after a struggle. It captures our aspirations, they note, for a fair and truthful relationship with the people of Australia and a better future for our children. They note they seek a Makarrata Commission to supervise the process of agreement making between governments and First Nations and truth-telling about our history. Finally, they invite the people of Australia to join this agreement-making initiative. We invite you to walk with us, they say, in a movement of the Australian people for a better future. So what is of great interest here too is the deliberate absence of the term reconciliation in the statement. This is most understandable when the formal reconciliation movement in Australia, a 3 decades-long movement that began in 1991, has been so sorely wanting. As many of you will know, Australia's reconciliation movement has been one without treaty, without a truth commission, without reparation or serious land rights. And indeed, we're in a climate that many have now come to strangely describe as post-reconciliation. Indeed, for some people, reconciliation, filled in Australia with so much disappointment and broken hope, has become a dirty word. So in using the term makarata instead, the Yolngu term for agreement after a fight, the convention, I argue, deployed indigenous diplomatic protocols of agreement making, thus setting the political agenda. That is, it was an indigenous-led political performance of diplomacy. As Professor Megan Davis wrote recently, makarata is a peacemaking event. It's a process to bring about reconciliation. It's a quest for peace and harmony. Our people are getting old. Too many bark petitions, too many statements. This is bad faith. The reconciliation process, she says, has stalled because it failed to do what reconciliation should do, talk about the truth. And by this she means matters of history. So in this statement from the heart, the long-standing symbol of heart can mean hope or bona fides, good faith or conscience. Heart too may be also the courage to remember, to honour, and the strength to forgive in order to reconcile. But it is not without demands. This is difficult and risky work, and it's about truth-telling from the heart. So this powerful statement from the heart from Uluru was offered in good faith and was not merely symbolic. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of Australia want structural and legal reforms, of course, a key aspect of what is termed transitional justice. But I hope you'll see too in this lecture tonight the way that reconciliation and recognition in the Constitution are linked. And indeed, recognition is often listed as one plank in the process of reconciliation for the nation. Now, of course, there's extensive debate about the detail of these proposals, and it's not my aim tonight to solve or address all of the details or points of constitutional law for you around the Uluru Statement. But what interests me is that Uluru, in the broadest terms, is another peacemaking or reconciliation performance. And as I said, it's Indigenous-led. And it shares many aspects of a broader reconciliation and redress process more globally that we see that has swept across settler nations around the world. Now, this is the cover of my book, and Julie Goff, Aboriginal artist from Tasmania, kindly allowed me to use her burning chair on the image. More about that later. Too often, reconciliation is left as a matter for legal scholars, sociologists, or to the realm of text. But as a humanities scholar interested in colonial histories, histories of emotion, of performance and politics, I wanted to ask human questions in my book. How do we as Australians, as individuals and groups, come to terms with that which is seemingly unresolvable, a foundational violence that persists, deeply disturbing in our national and individual psyches? How are these tensions expressed in public reconciliatory settler cultures, I asked myself. And what are the specific emotional economies, or specific repertoires, if you like, that emerge around reconciliation, specifically in settler nations? What ways do these ceremonies call on the violent past and remobilise the past? That's the question for historians. And importantly, for activists, what might have performed emancipatory politics, a new post-colonial sociality, indeed look like? So it's to this risky business of political performance and peacemaking, peace-building, and the politics of heart and truth-telling, matters of history, that it occur within reconciliation that I want to turn to in this paper. In my book, I wanted to trace the performative life, if you like, and its discontents of reconciliation. I wanted to explore the refoundings of the settler state and the way alternatives for the state are creatively reimagined, as well as the way the past is creatively mobilised and reworked in the name of social transformation. So here, I'm not arguing for or against reconciliation, but rather we must examine this phenomena as a vitally potent and creative aspect of our society. Across the globe, liberal democratic settler nations, generally resistant to formal processes of decolonisation, have been compelled to make new and urgent political compacts between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. They do this to address the legacy of violent pasts, to stabilise the present, and to imagine new national futures, especially in this age of apology or redress. In former colonies of British settlement, Australia, Canada, Aotearoa, New Zealand, South Africa, even the United States of America, where First or Indigenous peoples and settlers grapple with the pernicious and ongoing effects of colonisation, reconciliation has become a political catch-cry, and public projects for transformative change have been inaugurated in its name. And it's here, I think, that the utopian politics of reconciliation emerged most powerfully in the realm of public performance. And they're greatly bound up in a culture of economy of effect, expressing a desire, if you like, for a virtuous compact, unity and redemption under the sign of nation. So what I'm saying is these powerful performances can take us into the space of imaginary as we seek to create mythic covenants, but they also look to the violent past. And like all utopian forms you'll see tonight, the politics of reconciliation in settler societies, which sometimes demand consensus and often Indigenous volition, can also be rejected. So in my book, I wanted to honour these affecting reconciliation ceremonies, and while they always possess levels of controversy, these are genuine moves by many, many people, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, towards positive resistance and peace-building measures. These are emotional experiences for many people, and we shouldn't underestimate them. So we shouldn't analyse them out of existence, is what I'm saying. For many of us, non-Indigenous, myself, and also Aboriginal peoples, have over 30 years put their heart and souls into some of these performances. They find them powerful, moving, and utopic. So I want to honour that. But we also know that reconciliation is a very slippery and omnibus term. It can stretch from the symbolic right through to the structural and to the legal. It's a hugely complex phenomenon, and it's deeply ambivalent. On one hand, it's enormously utopic. That is, in Australia, many people long for some kind of effective, even mythic, cross-cultural refounding of the nation, filled with justice, redemption, good feeling, as a way to deal with the past. But on the other hand, top-down symbolic reconciliation ceremonies, especially in some cases when brokered by the state, can in fact become coercive and repressive. They can pull people into a false promise of heavy consensus. That in Australia, where reconciliation we see can never stand in for Indigenous sovereignty, reparation, land rights and treaty. So these tensions, I think you'll see, are expressed in these public performances. So tonight I'm going to explore 8 performances. We've just seen one, and I want to look at the way that state-based and other reconciliation performances, however fraught, seek a transition to a new moral order. And we need to understand them, I think, as critical rites of passage in settler societies or in Commonwealth societies. They work towards an imagined refounding of nation. They offer us a new way forward, but they're not without risk and controversy. And importantly, in search of a new emancipatory politics, I've looked at Indigenous-led refutations or reworkings of reconciliation in Australia, where state-based rituals have faltered. Some of these performances address difficult pasts, violent histories, and some of you may find this unsettling. Let's also think about emotions. I also want to, in this lecture, take account of the affective economies here and the cultural politics of emotion, as scholar Sarah Ahmad has termed them. Emotions can mobilise us towards certain public, collective forms of political action, where issues of truth-telling and matters of history and violence come together. You'll see here too many symbols and gestures of peacemaking processes that will be familiar to you: the handshake, the heart symbol, and many forms of walking together coming up over and over again. We'll also see some fiery acts of resistance and refutation, a creative revisioning, if you like, of what reconciliation might be. In the year 2000, some 17 years ago now, some 300,000 Australians walked over to Sydney Harbour Bridge. This was described in the media as a human sea of goodwill. People marched across bridges also around the entire nation. These are now known as the Great Bridge Walks, and some of you may have been there. They were brokered by the Aboriginal Council, the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation, and they used the slogan of walking together. You can see the badge there that people were encouraged to buy. A few of you may have been on these walks. They were uplifting, celebratory, unifying, eudaimonic, state-sponsored events full of good feeling. Participants were encouraged to walk together, and the historicity of the occasion was also made clear to the walkers in the promotional material. The mass bridge walk would be a new start. It would inaugurate an affective and powerful national refounding, and participants were going to be part of this crucial moment in the life of the nation. Yet, as some of you will remember, this occurred at a critical moment. Prime Minister John Howard refused to cross the Sydney Harbour Bridge, and he would not apologise. He refused to say sorry in relation to the release of the Bringing Them Home report on Aboriginal stolen generations. This was all in the midst of Australia's history wars. For some then, the bridge walk became more protest than celebration. Many people walked in silent reflection. Amidst the sea of good feeling and consensus, one word, sorry, stood out as a reminder and uncomfortable division underpinning the event. Appearing in the Sydney sky over 300,000 people at the bridge walk was the colossal word sorry. It floated over the iconic Sydney Opera House in the blue winter sky. The state-sponsored bridge walk became unruly. The politics of consensus and good feeling were interrupted. The plane that wrote this word in the sky was actually hired by a group of citizens, and they wrote the word that the Prime Minister refused to utter. The bridge walk participants also paraded placards and banners, and some of you will remember these. The placards had the word sorry, and some people in the crowd sang the treaty song by Aboriginal rock band Yothu Yindi, demanding treaty now. In the same year, I took part in Melbourne's Reconciliation March, attended by over 200,000 people. And being a small sort of person, I stood on a fire hydrant and I took photos of the huge crowd of walkers. And I too felt that the highly charged cross-currents of emotion in these peace-building performances, reflective, in fact, of the state of the nation. In the crowd, the embodied good feelings of togetherness and hope and optimism were mingled with feelings of anger, shame, and defiant chants calling for treaty and sorry. So these intense and contrapuntal, if you like, emotions interrupted the good feelings of consensus that the bridge walk was trying to build, on which the reconciliation paradigm rests. And they were indeed a sobering call to account for past and ongoing violent policies of the state. Like other marches, I experienced the bad feelings of disappointment and anger as the country's reconciliation journey seemed to go so much off course. While for some the Great Bridge Walks are recalled as moments of tremendous hope and good feeling, and some people still genuinely feel that, in hindsight, others have judged them to be wholly inadequate. Crucially, the mass bridge walks, as choreographed by the state, didn't permit any form of coming to terms with the trauma and violence around the means of Australia's colonisation. In other words, they didn't face the past. As Aboriginal author, historian and activist Jackie Huggins, and a member of the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation, wrote, The emotional triumphs of the bridge walks gave some people the sense that reconciliation had arrived, but the reality was that, significant as they were, the walks masked a harsh reality, a lot of what we call unfinished business. This unfinished business, of course, is a reconciliation process without treaty, substantive land rights, reparation or redress, and without a truth commission. And indeed, the notable historian Henry Reynolds has remarked that the great bridge walks around the country were indeed a kind of closing off, rather than a progressive movement forward for the nation. So I think you can see how the great bridge walks became a dense site of performative and emotional contestation concerning Australia's history, part of the emerging history wars, and they were expected, perhaps unrealistically, to do an enormous amount of symbolic, affective and political work. But some now argue the reconciliation movement indeed achieved little. The Conservative, or Liberal as we term it, Howard government from 1996 to 2007 became increasingly hostile to the aim of Indigenous self-determination, in favouring instead terms of assimilation. The government did not want black armband history, as they termed it, and they didn't want to dwell on any collective feelings of national shame. But this was so much in contrast to what many Aboriginal people were calling for, that is, acceptance of their view of the nation's history, not with the intention of promoting guilt on the part of white people, but to receive acknowledgement of their loss and suffering. And this did not occur. The bridge walks were noticeable for the absence of any reference to the violent past. And as I've said, they've been described as a form of unfinished business, and for scholars, they've been described as performances without history or critiqued for their historylessness. Now, performance 3. In the same decade, in 2006, Karen Casey's public, very personal, participatory art event called Let's Shake encouraged Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people to sit across from each other on tables and to, quote, extend a hand beyond their comfort zone and make a genuine connection with another person in the name of reconciliation. And this event was actually performed in many Australian cities around the country at the time. But these handshakes, you can't see it in the image, but they were very special. Casey, who is actually of Tasmanian Aboriginal descent, placed wet plaster between the participants' hands, and they had to hold hands together for 10 minutes and talk while the plaster dried. This proved to be a very powerful and moving form of personal connection for people as they sat and talked. And it left plaster shapes, if you like, little plaster negatives. Little shells of pure concentrated emotion or affect, if you like. And she also displayed these in galleries around Australia. And this is her artwork titled Contact Converse. But not everybody wanted to shake hands. And the People's Reconciliation movement of the 2000s, as it was billed, and its myriad emotions, seems, I think, a very long time ago now. As I've noted, conciliation in settler societies is historically and perpetually marked by an ambivalence. On one hand, it's utopic, with its promise of an imagined emotional refounding, a virtuous covenant, if you like, yet it can be highly coercive and repressive. Historically, Aboriginal people in settler societies all over are often conciliated or reconciliated, if you like, indeed to their own dispossession. And Tasmanian Aboriginal artist and scholar Julie Goff has rejected conciliation as any kind of unifying or indeed desirable process. In fact, in 2010, at a conference that I ran with Kate Darren-Smith from Melbourne University, Julie Goff spoke in her paper and said, "We are sick of being conciliated." And she argued and rightly pointed to Tasmania's, quote, genocidal history, where Tasmanian Aboriginal people have been subjected to the term conciliation for generations, but not its practice. Here, Goff is referring to the Great Conciliation of Van Diemen's Land in 1832, a moment that was crafted as a settler triumph, which marked, in fact, the end of the Black Wars in Van Diemen's Land, now Tasmania, between settlers and Aboriginal people. Now, as we know, Tasmanian people were almost eradicated, and many international scholars readily referred to what occurred there as genocide. Goff then made it an explicit connection between this colonial conciliation and the rhetoric of the contemporary Australian national reconciliation movement, thus rejecting any notion of a break between the past and the present in settler strategies of political diplomacy directed towards Aboriginal people. Now, in Goff's incendiary performance, which she titled Manifestation Bruny Island from 210, and she kindly allowed me to use this on my book cover, but also she allowed me to interpret it somewhat. You can see a European chair is struck ablaze with a Tasmanian Aboriginal spear on the rocky shores of the Tasmanian coastline. Symbolically, she recalls then the violent land wars of the Van Diemen's Land frontier and the effective guerrilla tactics of Aboriginal people who used fire to attack settlers' huts. The chair is suggestive, if you like, of the settled and the interior life of European invaders and their acts of domestication and of making home on Aboriginal land. Here again, I want to register what Sarah Ahmed calls the cultural politics of emotion. Not only the good feelings of reconciliation, but the array of bad feelings, the shame, anger, resentment, or the economies of affect that swirl around and are particular to the politics of reconciliation in our settler societies. We also need to take seriously the politics of resentment and anger. And Native American scholar Glenn Coulthard rightly notes this is not about Indigenous people creating obstacles to reconciliation, but we should read anger as a form of critical consciousness. Still burning, Goff's fiery image conveys anger and resentment and exposes the violent legacies of the past. The enactment too points to the repressive tendencies of the reconciliation paradigm, one that in this case is especially potent in Tasmania with its heavy history of violence and a crafted conciliation. So it's a very different kind of performance to Karen Casey's Let's Shake. And rather we might read Goff's performance as an act of Aboriginal refusal of European conventions. She's rejecting, I think, a resistance to the heavy narrative of consensus or the script of reconciliation that the settler state too often demands. And I want to think here too about performance, trust and risk. In her perceptive encounter between history, performance and colonialism in her wonderful book, The Archive and the Repertoire, Diana Taylor argues that performance, quote, transmits memories, makes political claims and manifests a group's performance. And the way that historical and social memory and cultural identity are reimagined through embodied performances is her subject. She asks us, what if we look through the lens of performed embodied behaviours, what would we know that we do not know? Whose stories, memories and struggles might become visible if we look at performance? And what tensions might emerge that would not be shown in texts or documents? I found this very instructive for thinking through performance. And I argue too that in settler societies, these performances are border crossings. They're about trust and risk. And here we see that Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples frequently not only have to face each other, but they often stand in for their own ancestors as they face the past together. Here too, we're at the extreme end, if you like, of the risk continuum, because these are new rites of passage. The stakes are high, and there are no comforting precedents to fall back on. Some people might be at best reluctant participants, and we can never know the outcome of the success of such a performance in advance. So they emerge in our societies, I argue, as new sites of cross-cultural negotiation, and they draw on very complex histories and genealogies of both Indigenous diplomacy, culture and knowledge, just as they draw on European cultural performative repertoires of diplomacy, the handshake, the heart, for example. These performances too are not like medieval reenactments, creative anachronisms that are distant in time and place. They're highly risky events, where, as I noted, people face each other, or they walk together, or they perform together. Sometimes they call the state to account and offer, we hope, a different order of national justice and possible new futures. So I want to turn now to a very different kind of walking together. As we know, the Great Bridge Walks had become an intense site of performative and emotional contestation around Australia's history. And they were expected to do enormous, perhaps too much symbolic work. But in the same year, 2000, another walk occurred. 2 weeks after the Great Bridge Walks, the Mile Creek Massacre commemoration ceremony occurred for the first time. It's now been running for 17 years. It also came out of this moment, the public and state reconciliatory framework that I've been speaking on. But it did much more, I think, to break open the silences of history. The ceremony acknowledged and commemorates one of the most significant acts of violence against Aboriginal people in Australian history. And I'm going to start by talking to you about this breastplate. It's a very powerful and difficult object from Australia's colonial past. It comes from the National Museum of Australia. It's a breastplate or a gorget, metal plates that some of you will know were given out to Aboriginal peoples by government and settlers to conciliate or to pacify them on colonial frontiers, much like in North America. And this one is unique. It's very special because it's in the shape of a heart, mostly their crescents. Breastplates, I acknowledge, are difficult objects, and I realise that for many people, especially Aboriginal people, they are greatly discomforting reminders of a colonial past. But I don't think that we should pull too many punches about the past. I came across this curious 19th century object, and I found myself strangely at the front door of a frontier massacre, Mile Creek. I found that it was given out a decade or so after the 1838 Mile Creek Massacre to Aboriginal people who were in the greater vicinity or region in New England. In the 1830s, as settlers moved increasingly into Aboriginal land in the colony of New South Wales, conflict arose with Aboriginal peoples, and a series of massacres of Aboriginal peoples occurred, enacted by both military and settlers at this time. On the afternoon of Sunday, the 10th of June, 1838, at a cattle station near Bingawa on the Gwydir River, or the Big River, you'll see Big River on the breastplate, a gang of 11 convict and ex-convict stockmen surrounded and tied up 28 Wiriyara Aboriginal men, women and children who were camped peacefully next to the huts at Mile Creek. Many of the men knew these Aboriginal people. They were taken away and slaughtered, and their bodies were burnt. Now, despite massive public outcry and a second trial, 7 men were eventually hanged in December 1838. Now, this was one of the very few instances when white men were tried, convicted and hanged for the mass killing of Aboriginal people in colonial Australia. When His Honour, Judge Burton, passed the sentence on the men, he remarked, "I sincerely hope that the grace of God may reach and penetrate the hardened hearts that could surround a funeral pyre lighted by themselves and gloat on the tortures and sufferings of so many of their fellow beings." Now, by the 1850s in the same area, remaining Aboriginal people continued to seek protection on stations where they could, with men and women often working as shepherds and stockmen. Now, this breastplate was given to you, Robert, could that be Uncle Robert, of the Big River and Big Leather tribes. by an unknown settler at Goonell Station, which was established in 1833 on the Gwydir River, or the Big River. Hugh Robert, or possibly Uncle Robert, we don't know, was probably a senior Aboriginal man and possibly a shepherd, and I have tried to trace him with the community. So this breastplate then joins part of a widespread settler tradition of giving crescent-shaped breastplates to Aboriginal people for alliance and pacification in a country where there was no formal treaties. So unlike North America, Australia had no formal treaties. With its heart-shaped form, it is exceptional, and if you look carefully at the top, there's an emu and a kangaroo, and there's an intriguing motif of crossed spears and gum boughs, similar to the style of a North American peace medal or treaty medal that were given out to Native Americans. In North America, often you see the peace pipe and the hatchet crossed, suggesting pacification or the halting of violence. I think this is an object that is very difficult to look at, knowing what we know. Murderous spirits and the politics of heart and compassion could mix uncomfortably together. Violence and intimacy could be combined. On frontiers, objects of alliance and friendship were given out all too late to an Aboriginal man after widespread violence to obtain his people's lands. On the other hand, perhaps it was expressive of compassion and conscience. I traced the man who handed out these medals, Robert Brown, and he was the owner of Goonell Station, to which the breastplate is linked. He was a devout and evangelical Christian. He went quite mad and was declared a lunatic in 1862, and he died a year later in an asylum. Did he commission this breastplate for the Aboriginal people living and working on Goonell Station in the New England region, which was only so recently beset by violence? We may never know, but it does show us how on colonial frontiers conciliation and violence could so readily go hand in hand. Now, Aboriginal artists have readily reworked and rethought some of these colonial objects and, in a sense, reclaimed them. And I want to show you this amazing artwork by Aboriginal artist Andrea Fisher, and she gave me permission to publish this in my book. Fisher has rightly critiqued the coercive message of the breastplate tradition with her reworking and subversion of the motif in her works Heart and Blood, and she refers openly to frontier violence. These are in the Museum of Democracy in Australia. So this is not dry history from textbooks. These are emotional artworks and performances where the past plays out powerfully in the present. They are, I argue, just as powerful as any Anzac commemoration, and they relate to the history, not of Gallipoli, but to the history that is under our very own feet. And the symbol of heart, of course, can mean conscience. It can also mean hope and acting in good faith. So, to continue the story of Myall Creek, every year now for 17 years, commemoration ceremonies have been held at the site of the Myall Creek massacre, so on the site of violence. Here, the descendants of Aboriginal people and settlers come together in good faith as part of a community-based reconciliation project. In 1998, after community discussion and at the suggestion of Aboriginal elder Sue Blacklock, the Uniting Church of Australia held a conference on reconciliation at Myall Creek. And this led to the creation of the Myall Creek Memorial Committee, including members Sue Blacklock and Uniting Church minister John Brown. In 2000, so 162 years after the massacre, the committee opened the Myall Creek Memorial, quote, in an act of reconciliation and in acknowledgement of the truth of our shared history. And this memorial, importantly, and the service itself, and I know some of you have attended this service, bring together the descendants of victims, survivors, and the perpetrators of the Myall Creek massacre. this is Aboriginal elder Sue Blacklock, who's been involved for 17 years with these ceremonies. So every year, several hundred people, in fact, sometimes up to 2,000 people now, gather from the local area across Australia to attend the Mile Creek reconciliation service. Facing the past and its legacy directly, the yearly commemoration service takes participants through a ritual at the very site where the massacre occurred. After morning tea and formal speeches, they walk to the site of the massacre in silent reflection. And a part of the ceremony is also to put stones on a reconciliation monument, which is reminiscent of the tradition of Shiva, or the Jewish tradition to commemorate the dead. The non-Aboriginal and Aboriginal participants in the reconciliation ceremonies at Mile Creek face each other and acknowledge the past together in a scripted performance where they speak to each other. Participants have described a great lifting. Some of them have said they felt set free when they acknowledged the violence of the shared past. These acts of reconciliation, I argue too, were only possible at Mile Creek because at least some form of justice in the colonial period had seen to be done, unlike, for example, Waterloo Creek, another site of violence, where the perpetrators were never charged. The plaque on a memorial stone at Mile Creek massacre site reads, "Erected on the 10th of June 2000 by a group of Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Australians in an act of reconciliation and in acknowledgement of the truth of our shared history, we remember them." So they're echoing some of the phraseology of the Anzac commemoration. As I said, every year, sometimes up to 2,000 people attend the ceremonies, and the site itself is now listed as part of an official Australian Heritage Register as an important national site of reconciliation. So these ceremonies, I'm arguing, are rites of passage in settler societies, crucial to peace building and healing, where the past has been strewn with conflict and trust can be low. And here, through truth-telling and ritual, the past is acknowledged and shared, and new stories are made. And you can see here Mr. Lyle Munro, who is shaking the hand of a descendant of one of the white murderers, Mr. Des Blake. And you can see, I think this is an uncomfortable handshake. I would say a very difficult handshake to make. Importantly, the Mile Creek Memorial Service didn't begin as a state-based top-down ceremony. It originated in a grassroots, community-inspired ceremony. While it emerged from a reconciliation framework or paradigm that the state had brokered, I want to argue that it was structured largely by Indigenous Aboriginal epistemology, and it combines some elements of European and Christian ritual. It works, I think, because it faces the past, but it's also largely an Aboriginal-led cross-cultural ritual. This was a very different kind of walk from the bridge walks in the same year, with our ambitious national refounding. So the Mile Creek ceremony is a very different kind of walking together. And they actually describe it as a way of walking into the past to revision the future. Australian scholar Katrina Schlunker, who has attended the memorial service, argues that this kind of ceremony offers us a new, innovative way to be Australian. The memorial service, she argues, is a post-colonial performance. It gives us a new place of possibility as well as mourning. It's an opening, she argues, into a new post-colonial way of being. Acknowledgement of the massacre forces the question, she argues, of, quote, how to be actively and ethically live with the knowledge of massacre which was undertaken to secure settlement for white Australians. This is a question, she writes, that is particularly tested in the annual performance of the memorial space, and it goes to the heart of reconciliation and Australia's unfinished business. But The site has been vandalised twice. Sorry, I'll just go. Not all Australians agree or feel comfortable with these kinds of performances. Many Australians are threatened by these kinds of performances, and they do not agree with the reconciliatory work that it offers. The site and the performance in this way then have a very heavy burden to bear too, because Mile Creek in some ways has come to stand in for all massacre sites, or perhaps too many massacre sites in Australia, and it has to carry a heavy symbolic burden. There's also hope now from the Friends of Mile Creek group to build a reconciliation centre there. Now, today in Australia, there are more memorials to massacre, that's certainly true, and they seek to perform a reconciliatory role, but they are still rare. And I think Mile Creek, you'll see, is just one response to the question of violence and reconciliation in contemporary Australia. So I want to turn back now to Tasmania and to talk about a Sorry Day ceremony at Risdon Cove in Hobart. In the same time period, in May 2001, a year after the Great Bridge Walks around the nation, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people met at Risdon Cove on the banks of the Derwent River in Hobart as part of National Sorry Day commemorations. Now, the event was organised by various reconciliation groups and church groups, and also attended by school children. As Aboriginal elder Aunt Brenda Hodge recalls, there were nearly 150 people present at the commemoration, and she says we all walked together through the pyramid structure on the site. Everyone was given a piece of black twine and white twine to represent black and white people coming together or walking together. We then walked slowly together over a bridge and up to the slope where the violence had occurred. We then came back to form a large reconciliation circle. And I want to acknowledge this photo by Grant Finlay, who was there. And this is a pre-digital era, and I really like his scrapbooking or his archiving and memorialising of the event for himself, and he allowed me also to use this photo. The Risdon Cove ceremony, as I noted, was held on a foundational site of violence in early Tasmania, where up to 40 to 50 Aboriginal people were killed. This is what scholars generally agree. I've pointed to the uncomfortable politics of the handshake and the ambivalence of reconciliation, and we do need to think too critically about sorry and what sorry days might mean. Of course, they are greatly affecting ceremonies that build consciousness. They're consciousness-raising ceremonies, and they allow people to say sorry and people to forgive. But we need to think more carefully about the effective work they do, for whom, and the ways in which the emotional economy of remorse and forgiveness, dominant in the Christian tradition, might be contested by those who refuse to forgive or may not wish to forgive. So the problem with this reparative model of justice, of course, and we see it here in the Mile Creek ceremony, is that some of these ceremonies people may feel as victims may deny them the right to refuse to be reconciled with the perpetrator, which in this case, in Risdon, is actually the state, the British government, and military and settlers were involved. While the Risdon Cove ceremony did address the violence of the past directly, its aim was not centred around Aboriginal experience or Aboriginal cultural reclamation. It was not, therefore, at its heart, a centrally decolonising experience, but it was an important event, one in an array of many, that was attended by church groups and school children. And as I said, it was a consciousness-raising event, as much about mourning and as commemoration. And I don't want to undermine this important work. However, and crucially, Indigenous peoples also have the right to refuse the politics of sorry and the broader program of reconciliation with its Christian principles of restorative justice, which is based on a linear model of confession, forgiveness, and then moving on. It can be coercive, and it can place a hefty psychic burden on Aboriginal people to forgive, but without the benefits of mutual reparation. So one scholar has termed this the cunning of reconciliation, and another has termed it compulsory compassion. So given this, I want to turn to another ceremony, number 7. I want to talk about the Black Lion ceremony in Tasmania that was held on the east coast at a site called Three Thumbs. And here we see a very different order of cross-cultural and affective performances, not based on the politics of sorry, but a way that draws differently and revisions the past quite differently. In October 2001 in Bushland at Three Thumbs, one of the key sites of the notorious Black Line in Van Diemen's Land, a military operation, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people gathered and they were led by Tasmanian elder Aunt Ida West. And they held a quiet and deeply felt ceremony of remembrance, survival and healing. Now, the Black Line was part of Tasmania's Black War. Some of you will know this. It led to the almost total annihilation of Aboriginal people between about 1828 and 1834. But the site where the ceremony was held is now a popular picnic spot. It looks over the Freycinet Peninsula. And a year after the Australia's nationwide bridge walk for reconciliation, this different cross-cultural ceremony and performance was held, and it didn't focus exclusively on sorry between settlers and Aboriginal people. It was not a state-based or top-down ceremony. It was another grassroots ceremony, a performance that was partly about healing, but it importantly for us as historians called on the colonial past in its foregrounding and remembrance of colonial violence on the site of the Black Line. The performance was directed by the Aboriginal community, and it was led and conceived by Aboriginal Ida West in conjunction with Reverend Grant Finlay, whose photo I showed you earlier, from the Uniting Aboriginal and Islander Christian Congress. And it was designed with cross-cultural and Indigenous Christian rituals. Now, Ida West, and I will show you a picture in a minute, she was a member of the Glenorchy Hobart Reconciliation Group. So this is a community group that ran for many years, and it's one of the last groups that is still running after this great reconciliatory decade. One of the last in Tasmania. Now, the image I show you here are the proclamation boards that were given out by Governor Arthur in the midst of the Black War. They were given out to Aboriginal people to effect some kind of conciliation through pictograms. Now, you can see in the central vignette, which is my interest, the handshake again, the conciliatory handshake between the governor and the Aboriginal chief. Now, what's important about these boards, and there is now more scholarship on them, is that not only were they handed out quite late, so much of the violence had already occurred, but also they were handed out between two declarations of martial law. So the tree on Register 3 gives a clue. This is summary justice on a violent frontier. So the boards, in effect, were failed objects of diplomacy, and some people see them as a conceit. I think they're very interesting visual documents. Now, the Black War resulted in mass slaughter of Aboriginal peoples on an island where, on contact, it was believed between 6,000 to 8,000 people had originally lived. By late 1830, Governor Arthur had lost faith in any possibility of conciliation, and his desperate solution was to conduct a military-style campaign to capture or force Aboriginal people into the Forestria and Tasman peninsulas. He collected 2,200 men, 550 of which were troops, and the rest were enthusiastic civilians. Now, the Black Line was this line that moved through the island to sweep up Aboriginal people. And as historian Lyndall Ryan argues, it was in fact the largest force ever assembled against Aboriginal people anywhere in Australia. The campaign was thought to have been a bit of a ruse or a folly, and people believed it to be short. But as Lyndall has shown, and so have other scholars, it in fact ran for far longer. Rather than a 6-week folly, it was indeed a 15-month campaign that was more successful in its goals of Aboriginal eradication than many people realise. It was a serious and expensive operation. It was by no means a mere folly. And in fact, there were 3 lines, not 1 line, moving through the landscape. And scholars have plotted these on maps. Now, at bushland at Three Thumbs near Orford, on the eastern coast of Tasmania, this is where Aboriginal people, in fact, broke through the black line. There's the handshake again. So it's a site of significance and emancipation for Aboriginal people. It has great meaning. Late at night, in the midst of a storm, several Aboriginal people forced their way through the black line, and 2 Aboriginal people were killed. So in the year 2001, just after the Great Bridge Walks, this local ceremony was crafted and choreographed. Aunt Elder Ida West, who has now passed away, sits in the front here in the mid-ground with her back turned to us, and I've been given permission to show her image by her grandchildren. And this is a very different kind of memorialisation. It foregrounds and commemorates Aboriginal escape and defiance of the Black Line, and it seeks to overcome trauma of the line and the heavy weight of Tasmanian history. So this ceremony was crafted between Ida West and Grant Finlay, and she called them services at sites of violence. So the Glenorchy Reconciliation Group, which is a group of Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people, rolled out a line of black cloth. They stepped over it and under it. Different words were said, and interestingly, passages were read out by 2 important historians, Lyndall Ryan and Henry Reynolds, and there were Indigenous and Christian rituals involved in this service. They said, quote, "In gathering here, we say that history is not the last word. The Black Line is not the only movement across the land. There is another movement, a movement of survival, of renewal, a movement of healing. And rather than being organised by a government, the spirit is stirring within people's own lives, among families and communities." So the Three Thumbs performance addressed the Aboriginal past, overturned the heavy colonial and accepted narratives to reveal, if you like, the other side of the frontier. And they reached into the mythic to build community survival and empowerment. And I think what's really impressive about Ida West's work, and I think you'll also begin to see how some of these ceremonies are created by very impressive and visionary Indigenous women, is that she had in fact, with her group, visited many sites around the island of Tasmania. And she did hold private ceremonies at Cape Grim. There was also a massacre there. That was a private ceremony that was not for non-Aboriginal people. But we can see this, I think, as a deliberate process of ritualised healing or countermapping, where each site of violence was physically visited by Ida's group, ceremonies performed, and the landscape was, if you like, re-sacralised or returned to the sacred, and she did view it that way. The services, as she termed them, had a great amount of symbolic and political work to do, so much more than memorialisation. It allowed perhaps for people that these dark sites could be new spaces, innovative new ways of being could be forged, and they could offer, if you like, a different order of politics. I think then these ceremonies led by Indigenous people can crack open, if you like, the heavy consensus politics of reconciliation and one nation that sit heavily in Australia. They have the potential to unravel the tight connections between nation, war and Anzac that is guiding our national mythology by directly exposing memorialising and overcoming the violent frontier wars on our very own soil, at our very own doorstep. In some ways, I think Ida West had the last word when she declared, quote, "Our history is not the last word." It was an affirmation of Aboriginal survival and a rejection of the heavy historical narrative of both a great conciliation and an erroneous Aboriginal extinction. But it also pointed to an as yet unwritten future. This is performance 8, still in Tasmania. Now, in December of last year, that future and unique way of addressing the past came to the fore again in Tasmania. In the midst of intense national debates about federal constitution, reconciliation, and in fact, at a time when the Australian states were already dealing with this within their own constitutions and running formal state-based treaty talks with Aboriginal groups, Tasmania in December also came on board. Now, many people didn't realise it, but on December the 15th, just before Christmas last year, Tasmanian Aboriginal leader, Elder Patsy Cameron, and the Tasmanian Governor, the first woman Governor of Tasmania, Honourable Kate Warner, signed an historic new preamble in the Tasmanian Constitution. Although Tasmania is a site, like the rest of Australia, that apparently never had a formally accepted or written treaty, the treaty that was struck by Aboriginal leader Manalagena, a verbal treaty that Aboriginal people could live on the island and they could come back to their country one day where people could live together, was in a way symbolically re-enlivened in this island state. It was summer holidays and many people in Tasmania seem to have missed this in the news, but I also think that people missed it because the media around it was not controversial. The solution to write Aboriginal sovereignty and presence into the Tasmanian state constitution was legally elegant and largely uncontroversial. Many meetings and many talks had been held leading up to this event, where sovereign to sovereign, the Governor and Patsy Cameron made the agreement. In this way, too, Tasmania now has joined the rest of the country at a state level in recognising the state's First Peoples, a missing chapter, people say, in the Constitution. And you can see here that in the news and quite openly in the local Mercury newspaper, recognition and constitutional change is directly related to reconciliation. So like the other states, Tasmania's original constitution had made no mention of the Indigenous presence in the land at all. At the ceremony, Governor Warner said this historic move was, quote, not an act of tokenism, but another step on the journey of reconciliation. And the words in the Constitution are, and whereas the Parliament, on behalf of all the people of Tasmania, acknowledge the Aboriginal people as Tasmania's first people and the traditional and original owners of Tasmanian lands and waters, recognises the enduring spiritual, social, cultural and economic importance and traditional lands and waters to Tasmanian Aboriginal people, and recognises the unique and lasting contributions that Tasmanian Aboriginal people have made and continue to make to Tasmania. So this is a very recent performance. To close and to return to the beginning now, in the national statement from the heart at Uluru made to the nation, I think this was indeed a form of makarata or treaty making, facing the past, facing matters of sovereignty, power and historical truth-telling. The Aboriginal filmmaker Rachel Perkins wrote of the statement from the heart at Uluru, the statement delivers a realistic consensus to the people of Australia. It's pragmatic but principled. The consensus position is both big-hearted and hard-headed. But while state-based constitutional change has occurred around the country, at the national level it has not. As Australians we wait for the federal government to formally respond, and it's now been 5 months. I cannot tell what will happen. So to close now, I hope that I've shown you this evening what reconciliation looks like on the ground. This is not always a top-down state-based phenomenon or a text-based phenomenon, but it's something that's worked out at the grassroots level, and partly through the powerful movements of public performance. Rather than a great Australian silence, that's the anthropologist Stanner's comment, which he made in 1968 and which has resonated throughout history for 50 years. I think you can see here a cacophony of reconciliation performances, an array of enactments which address the past in very creative ways. These are resistive, productive, polyvalent, and they all have different orders of emotion and effect. They are state-based as well as subversive or grassroots. I hope too that you've seen how bodies, objects and performances can come together with Indigenous and European genealogies of history, heritage and tradition to form a distinct genre of performance, if you like. And I think these are supercharged histories where descendants of violence face each other or act together. And you'll notice too that in many of these performances which seek to address the past, the ones that I've picked out at least seem to be led by Indigenous women, powerful women, strategic long-term activists and leaders in their community with significant political acumen. Perhaps most of all then, these performances are forms of makarata, Indigenous-led forms of peacemaking after a fight. And most of all, by paying attention to these performances, I think we can see there is such a thing as an expansive, critical, Indigenous-led reconciliation, a decolonised reconciliation, if you like, which is a day-by-day personal and relational endeavour. So through an attentive and critical emancipatory politics led by Indigenous peoples, I hope that I've shown you that sometimes glimmers of new post-colonial futures do appear. Thank you.
I'd like to call upon the Deputy Director of Menzies Centre, Dr. Simon Slight, to give the vote of thanks and lead our questions.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm really delighted to respond to what I think has been an outstanding Reese Memorial Lecture, the Memorial Lecture for 2017. I've had the pleasure of responding to our Reese lecturers for some 7 years now, and I hope that previous speakers won't mind me opining that tonight's talk is up at the very top of a strong selection in terms of its urgency and its significance. This evening, I think we've learned a good deal. We've taken on board the failures of top-down decolonisation in Australia, for instance. We've encountered the coercive impacts of short-sighted reconciliation initiatives. And we've experienced the economies of affect that burn bright and cut deep. We've learnt too that unsettlement and disruption, as well, when appropriate, as hands clasped together in friendship, are surely called for in any reckonings with the past. As many in the audience familiar with Australian history will know, the wheel of colonisation rolled far and wide in Australia. The notion of the wheel, in Deborah Bird-Rose's formulation, also suggesting colonisation as process, not event. The ongoing legacies of that process are pervasive. The expression of makarata, agreement after a fight, reminds us that a contest about the past and about the present must very much be had. Substantial sections of the non-Indigenous Australian public, as one can so easily see by scrolling through comments threads beneath news articles, are still a very long way from accepting on-shore violence and persecution as fundamental to the continental story. But this edifice can't hold, and the dam is breaking. Performative memory has had a part to play in this. Penny's lecture this evening has offered us a politics of the heart, her own as well as that of her protagonists and Australia as a whole. For us as listeners, that process of opening out may well have been troubling. It's hard to forget the searing image and underlying story of the heart-shaped breastplate, for example. For this is indeed a supercharged history, as Penny put it so eloquently. Her case studies have taken us across some fascinating terrains of land, body and soul, to performances just as powerful as any Anzac commemoration, to chairs still ablaze, and to much more besides. To invoke the words of the great social historian E.P. Thompson, what we've perceived this evening are the contours of an alternative nation, a history from below that forces considerations of pasts in the present and the today in the long and not so long ago. The implications of this are fundamental for all Australians. Though we didn't feature in tonight's talk, in thinking through Penny's assessments, we might like to ponder Gerald Visner's concept of survivance, a concept inspired principally by Native American histories, but readily applicable outside that territory. Sometimes described as a mix of survival and resistance, or else of survival and endurance, survivance, in Visner's words, is and I quote, an active sense of presence over absence, the continuation of stories, a repudiation of dominance. Survivance is a practice, he continues, an active presence, more than the instincts of survival, function, or subsistence, and a practice to which Indigenous stories are central. Societal change can come through embracing survivance, it is held, and we might like to link Visner's comments that survivance is the heritable right of succession or reversion of an estate to shifting views of the heart of Australia, often located geographically and spiritually at the great glowing monolith of Uluru. Once cast dismissively as the centre point of the so-called dead centre, it was here, significantly, that the Statement from the Heart was issued in May 2017. As part of an expansive Indigenous-led decolonisation, as Penny puts it, the statement returns us to the notion of the red centre, the giant red heart as oxygen pump and emotional core. We might like, in reflecting further, to tie together our thoughts on the past and possible future via an altered idiom. Home is where the heart is, it's often said, but hope surely is where the heart is too. These then are just a few stray thoughts in response to tonight's lecture.